Good morning. My deep respects to the local people who have never ceded their sovereignty. Also, my thanks to Jane White and RMIT, who have done a fabulous job in organising this conference. And this session really is a session about the journal, but I'm taking the long way round the journal. And I'm going to be talking about the process by which we initiated really what is the first video journal in the world in the humanities and social science, a video journal. And one has to ask the question, why did it take so long in the publishing world to develop a video journal? Because going back even to the medieval ages, I was at Uppsala recently, and you see their big demonstration theatres where very steep lecture hall focused on a table where they used to do post-mortems on corpses and everybody could see what was happening. And so, in the realms of medical science, but also we would say biological science, because Linnaeus was up in Uppsala, and this was the first introduction of systematic biology in the world, not so long ago. We had the concept of the demonstration, and now the notion of the demonstrations come back into play, and it's become a very important concept, because there are so many different kinds of activity that are not best represented through the word. So it's like loosening the hold on the logos and looking at images rather than text. And I think that one of the arguments that I made with the journal to a series of corporate people was around it was around medical science, and I said to the CEO of one of the publishing companies, what would you rather do? Would you rather have your surgeon, if you're about to undergo open heart surgery, would you rather have your surgeon read a couple of tomes on latest surgery techniques, or would you prefer, or do you think he would prefer to see those surgery techniques in operation? And of course, he got it. He got the concept at that point in one go. But of course, in pedagogy, in education, in music, in all forms of performance, in laboratory science, in music, there are so many applications really based on the concept of video and of not just images but moving images here. So I start with a slide on journology and wanting to talk about cultural evolution of a global knowledge system. Here we have an emerging infrastructure of world knowledge for the first, as a single, planetary system for the first time, and it is shaping up. But I want to draw attention to the fact that this is extremely recent. In historical terms, we're talking about only 450 years of scholarly publishing. So really, us moderns are really only in the early days of understanding what it means for the human species to talk about a single planetary system, an infrastructure for world knowledge per se. The first journal I mentioned here, actually, I say first in inverted commas there because the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1665, not technically the very first, because there was a French journal, there were some Italian journals, particularly during the Renaissance, which were, let me say, concerned with Renaissance arts. They were journals and poetry and literature. But of course, we know that Italy led the scientific revolution through people like Galileo and so on. So I mention this here, this concept of history in terms of 5 stages of the journal, of the development of the journal. So, first you had the circulation of scientific letters. In fact, also, scientific visits made by, people coming to conferences like this, not so much conferences, but meeting one another. I think of, Voltaire coming to, being invited to Edinburgh, for instance. You have the development of print-based production, 1665, starting in 1665, and of course that is the dominant model today. We've done some certain things to it, and we have really, after the invention of printing, we have moved to an industrial model of journal publication. So we know what the standardized product is, right? 6,000 or 7,000 words, it has a certain structure. Every journal seems to follow pretty well the same kind of industrial model. It has some strong advantages, but it is not very experimental, it's not very innovative. The model has basically been propagated and developed by academic publishers who, in terms of ownership, through merger and acquisition, like all capitalist enterprises, have become fewer and fewer. The ownership has become now in the hands of the big five publishers. There are some university presses, of course, and there are some learned societies like this one that own their own publication. But basically, the planetary system is in the hands of some good capitalists, well, good, might be questionable, here, who make extraordinary amount of money from it. Because basically, it's based on a slave economy for academics, We are all intent on getting published. We don't get paid for doing it. And, they have a free market here, free labor market here. And, therefore, companies like Elsevier make in excess of 15% profit per year, sometimes even more than that. So, I think we need to draw attention to the political economy around publishing. So the next stage, let me say, here is the electronic journal that really began to kick in the 90s, in the early 1992, we had the first electronic journal starting at that point, which of course now has a whole range of other accoutrements attached to it, best papers, most cited papers, most read papers, the number of people visiting the site, hyperlinks from one paper to another, and so on. And then I mentioned this separately, the open access movement, which really began in the early 90s. And it was inspired through experiments that took place mostly in educational pedagogy. So, education was to the forefront of that. But, and I'm going to come back to the concept of open access because I think it's a very, very strong concept that now, in 2020, has reached a global watershed. So we have the video journal then as the first video journal that as a means of scientific communication, developing and going online in 2016. So that's a real plus for a small learned society. So when we look at the global knowledge system, we're articulated through the disciplines. We're looking at approximately 19,000 journals, and there is roughly also about 19,000 universities in the world. So as I say, we're at a very early stage at the moment with journals. We're only in terms of the global infrastructure, we're only 450 years into this experiment, and we see it in cultural terms as a form of evolution of knowledge systems here. Now we're about to see, and we are beginning to see, the impact of big data, analytics, which are really transforming publishing, and also open access. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so next slide, let me see. Where do I point this? Anywhere? Doesn't matter. Okay, so there's the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society, the first science journal in the world, really. And can I say, if you go into the site, you will see all the back issues have been digitized. So you can go back to you can go back to the first journal, really, the earliest journal in continuous production. You can go back to 1665, and the editor there was Henry Oldenburg, a German who came across, who was associated with the Royal Society. I think I mentioned Henry Oldenburg here, who was the secretary of the society. But the journal in those days, there was only one author. It was Henry Oldenburg, who wrote everything. He made notes on conversations, on experiments, and the journal at that early stage was really just a one-man, let me say, review and reportage. So that was Henry Oldenburg. No, can I say, no peer review at that point. We didn't have peer review at that point. And now, in terms of the history of academic publishing, what we saw, particularly during the 18th century, was the strong emergence of learned societies, the origins of the periodical policies developing, the history of peer review. But can I say, peer review is very recent historically. You know, let me put it this way. And it was introduced for reasons that really had nothing to do with what we might say the liberal rhetoric of sharing or collaboration or whatever. The Royal Society of Edinburgh, not London, introduced the concept of peer review 100 years later, after the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society started. And I might say here also that why did they do it? They did it to indemnify themselves. So they didn't make, so that they were protected from making claims, false claims. And, you know, in those days, of course, one had to be very careful of the church, well, right through to, you know, well after Charles Darwin, where scientific results really had big theological effects, if I might put it that way. So the history of peer review, let me say, the Lancet medical journal, the leading medical journal, didn't introduce peer review until 1948. So it's quite late in the piece. And I might say also now peer review is the gold standard. And it's the gold standard not only for journals, but also for promotion and a whole range of other academic related practices. I do want to mention also the political economy of the publishing industry, because I think that if you do not understand the kind of emerging political economy, you miss a lot about what's happening in the publishing world. And, you know, so whenever I'm talking about that, I want to talk about political economy, but I also want to talk about the politics of big publishing and what that means. And I've already mentioned that over the period of time, what we've seen is a narrowing. And we've seen a narrowing on the one hand, the big companies, through merger and acquisition, taking over the smaller companies. The development of, let me say, for want of a better term, the ranking industry. Those large organizations like Clarivate that rank universities and are in league with big publishers and also with university consortia. You get a notion of how tight that infrastructure is and how much it is based in a sort of capitalist logic, I suppose. Although there are some differences maybe in China, I think that actually the big publishers have moved in there as well, and although we might see that changing. So I talk about the changing ecology of academic publishing as well, which I think is very, very important through AI, through concepts of deep learning, through the data, big data analytics, which is really changing the face of publishing now as well. The rise, of course, of digital media and open access, and finally, the rise of video communication. Well, why has it taken us so long? The first video occurred in the United States in 1951, and here we are, hitting 2020 very shortly, and really the notion of video as a means of scientific communication is yet not developed. And you have to ask yourself, why is academic publishing so incredibly slow in keeping up with the huge changes that we've seen take place with YouTube? We have 10,000 items added to YouTube every day. So let's look at the changes to the scholarly journal communication system in terms of publishing market, new models, open access, consortia, licensing, what they call bundling, globalization, the growth of emerging regions, the way research is conducted, also the use of networks, the way in which journal has led a series of changes to academic practices, data-driven science, and so on. And I mentioned here, I don't know, I gave a paper in this at Uppsala a couple of weeks ago, or no, a couple of months ago, I should say. Nobody had heard of Plan S. Plan S. By the European Council, who have mandated open access by 2020, next year. Any journal which is publicly funded through public research funds must be open access, must be freely available to the public, to anybody, can be freely downloaded by the Global South. So that's a big deal, and that means no hybrid publishing. So Plan S, if you don't know about it, we're talking here about approximately $9 billion worth of European funding. $9 billion, right? So, but also agreements in India, in China, not the US. The US won't sign this document, so they won't be part of that mandating. So you get a kind of split in the scientific journals. But this is a relentless process, and by 2020, academics will be hearing much more about it. The problem is here that it's an author-pays system. It's author-pays, and the author has to build their research publishing into their research budgets in terms of application to public funding authorities. So, it really does disadvantage the humanities greatly, sadly, because humanities' proportion of that $9 billion euros, is only a tiny proportion, and humanities scholars are unused to applying, first of all, to author-pays journals, and secondly, unused to building publishing costs into their research budgets. Okay, so I wanted to say also, to make the point that when we're talking about infrastructure and the emergence of a single planetary system, we are talking about the way in which, historically now, scholarly communication is linked to a deeper media ecology. And I've mentioned openness, new forms of openness here. I've mentioned also big data, open government data, a huge movement. Educational data mining, and I wanted to mention visualization because that's one of the agendas that this journal has formulated as a policy, that we are interested in visualization. Methodology is visualization. How, particularly with the inflow of huge quantities of data, how we can visualize it, how we can understand it. So, these are related to aspects of the deeper media ecology to do with journals per se. And, oh, goodness me, I've got this slide here with one word on it. much better way of presenting a slide here, dataism, which is, really now seen as a philosophy in itself, based on data, singly on data. And there are people like Yuval, the Israeli popular philosopher who sold millions of books, who champions, who looks at and examines this concept of dataism. Oh, okay. Principles underlying, I don't want to talk about that, sorry. I do want to say that that social media does bring one of the new, I think, new elements that we have to confront as academics now, is that research is very much oriented towards two concepts. One is impact, looking for practical impacts. The other is engagement, and community engagement. And now university policies are reflecting that, and also having a big effect on academic journals. So let me move on. I provide this slide because it does show you, here is a sort of, let me say, you all know the problems with, citations in journals. It's a crude measure. It's sort of like quasi-objective, I suppose. There are many different forms of journal citation at the author level, the article level, the journal level. You see that it's quite randomly applied there through Web of Sites, Scopus, Google Scholar, and other resources. The largest, let me say, aggregator, internet aggregator sites for journals worldwide. There's really no overall consistency, although people, let me say, probably the most important one here is the journal citation at the level of the article. Although also we might see also at the level of the author. So, and you had here in Australia, you had a banding study going back into the mid-2000s, where you took, I don't know whether you know, the Australian Science Council took all the journals in the world at that point, some 18,000 journals, and ranked them from A to C. And there are some that didn't make that ranking. And now, although that is defunct, that ranking of journals is defunct, there are many university departments that actually say to their academic staff, you must publish in these journals. So it's becoming a lot more prescriptive. I know friends of mine in management department, I won't name the university now, who only really get credit for publishing in the top, 3 or 4 journals in management. And increasingly, the university administration is driving that process. You also know the publishing cycle. This is the old model, the old industrial model of the publishing cycle, which is now being experimented with quite considerably. And I think that in particular, we are looking at new forms of peer review. I know that Nature has returned to that topic on a number of occasions to talk about the problems to do with elite peer review. You know, the elite peer reviews tend to be mostly male, mostly professors, and there's a kind of, they say, an inbuilt conservatism to that process, which penalises women, people of colour, often younger scholars as well, where maybe, you know, if you had a different set of peers, they would select something different. They might select a different kind of article. But we also know that, at least in the soft disciplines, ideology is a real problem, you know, where ideology is theory-driven. Okay, so I want to mention my own, you know, I've been working in this field for quite a long time. I established a journal called Access in 1981, which has really been in continuous production. Since then, I was the editor for, like, I don't know, maybe 19 years, I think, before I went offshore from New Zealand. We're in the process of digitizing back copies, you know, because the digital archive now is a major, a major resource for journals. A journal called Educational Philosophy and Theory, 14 issues per year, is ranked 18th in the world out of 135 in the history and philosophy of science. Our mandate really is about publishing as many scholars as we can, rather than really looking at the notion of impact. Because if we restricted it to 3 issues of journal per year, then the impact factor would be, would be huge. But really, we're not really interested in that concept. We are much more interested in publishing younger scholars, and also publishing Chinese scholars and indigenous scholars. So, you know, those are our two outreach policies here. I established a couple of journals when I was in Glasgow, University of Glasgow, one called Policy Futures in Education. The editor there now is Mark Tessa. I've handed it on to him, and another one called E-Learning and Digital Media back in 2003 and 2005 respectively. Another one from a New York publisher called Knowledge Cultures. The Video Journal of Education and Pedagogy 2016. We established also, if you're interested, something called the Editors Collective, where editors from various journals can begin to share the editing experience, and that's been very successful. I think we have like 13 journals in that stable, with another 23 wanting to join, you know, because in the academic environment, the concept of editing, you know, is an undifferentiated concept and really doesn't get taught. Neither does the publishing industry. So most recently, I established the Beijing International Review of Education because Tina Beasley and I are employed full-time in Beijing. And one of the reasons they wanted to employ us was because they wanted to establish an English language journal in Beijing, and you know, it's a pretty august institution, so it means a great deal to them. And you know, when you look at publishing in China, actually the first issue discusses exactly that question. While the top scientific institution in the world is actually Chinese, you know, the Chinese Academy of Science is number 1. The Chinese publishing in science last year published over 366,000 papers, and that was the first time that China actually pipped the US in the production of scientific papers. So, if you're operating with a different kind of stereotype about Chinese publishing, in the, let me say, in the social sciences and the humanities, they do lag behind us in the West, and one of the reasons that we're in Beijing is to we're establishing a number of journals, English language ones. In China at the moment, there are less than 250 English language journals, most of which are owned by by Western publishers. And the last one there is Agora, a concept of Agora which is to do with the future of the academic journal, and it's one that we're establishing, we're in the process of establishing at the moment. So this is the Editors Collective, the mission, which goes back to the Charter of the Royal Society, and talks about the development of the academic as a cornerstone of the emerging global system. And it's really interested in, it's a humanities-based project bringing together journals in the humanities to develop experimental and innovative approaches to publishing. So we're committed to the process of innovation, and we're really interested in trying to educate other scholars about the publishing industry. So yeah, have a look at the site. So here, it brings me really to the establishment of the Video Journal of Education and Pedagogy. You see, this is the first proposal that we put up from the University of Waikato in 2013, with a proposal to establish the first video journal, and we really, it turned out very, very differently because our stakeholders were very different, and we adopted a different business model. But what we were trying to do, a revolutionary video database in those days, back in 2013, dedicated to teaching laboratory fundamentals through simple, easy to understand video demonstrations. We were basing it on the Journal of Visualized Experiments, which in science, it has a track record and it goes back quite a long way. Peer-reviewed, PubMed indexed video journal to increase the productivity of scientific research. Going back to those early days, we're talking about some 2,384 video articles, and some over 8,000 authors in that respect. So here's the kind of, I don't have a video of it, but here here is an example of what it looks like online, the Journal of Visualized Experiment. It was a very important model for us in our early thinking about the journal, and we looked at the Journal of Visualized Experiments as really one of our leading examples of existing models. So you see when it was established, the first scientific video journal, it was trying to establish a new tool in the life of science publication and communication. Why did it take us so long? Why is the innovation in academic publishing so slow? Well, from my own personal experience, I have to say that if you're making a handsome profit of 17% per year, why do you want to change the business model? Why do you want to change the business model? Really, most of the changes that are taking place are to enhance that profit margin. So data visualization. So here, I think one of the early concerns for us was to look at how we might develop forms of visualization, data visualization, as an asset for this journal. And I say this is part of that original proposal. We're still at the early stage of understanding how we communicate with data and how traditional academic forms of publishing can be fused with sophisticated interactive information displays. And I think that the next realm, next realm of innovation has to be about moderation discussion elements, and in particular, something that begins to facilitate interactivity between scholars. I know, in the field of particle physics, there are maybe 300 scientists here. They all know each other pretty well. They move to a preprint kind of model where they publish online and the reviews take place once the paper has been published and modified in order to speed up the innovation cycle. There are many different kinds of models here, and that interactivity is one aspect of the model of academic publishing that we need to enhance. Because it's rather haphazard at the moment. If you come across this journal and you read this article, you might identify who the author is, and you might want to read other articles that this person wrote, and then you integrate that into your own research, and that can be a very timely process. And remember, you must have experienced this when you're submitting to journals. You find that you send the publication in, it's then reviewed, peer-reviewed. You might get a note from the editor that asks you to make some changes. You send those changes back. It might be reviewed again. And then at some point in the future, when the paper is placed in the production line, it will be published. Now, for some journals, that might be many, many months. It might be 18 months. It might be 2 years. So there is a big lag here. And the interactivity that takes place, is an interactivity that takes place over many, many months. I think really we should be looking at a form of innovation which can enhance that interactivity. So our vision back in those days was to a revolutionary video clearinghouse, which we haven't established yet, and database dedicated to social teaching and learning through simple and easy understand video clips and demonstrations. Well, and we looked at these video sections, possibilities, the keynote presentations, recorded panels, video blogs, think aloud, video case studies, student-created videos, and so on. I might say, now that we own the journal and we have stabilized it and we have a community, this is the time for us to begin to experiment with new forms of video articles or image-based articles. And there are this list of possibilities, but there are many others also that will enhance the journal through interactivity. So watch this space. So here we go. Our early conception of the video journal of pedagogy was to integrate visual approaches to educational research. And practitioner knowledge. Since then, we really have begun to encourage to widen our ambit, really encourage relationships with other organizations and academics who are interested in video. So we have, right from the very beginning, our early conference in Zagreb, we had a very strong tradition of video activism. And some of them were educational, some of them weren't. They were, I remember a wonderful video that was presented at that conference by a group of Zagreb feminists who were part of animal liberation. They wanted to catch all the tomcats in Zagreb, and to humanely neutralize them so they couldn't continue to have kittens and so on, which were very destructive. It was a video about you've seen a mad cat, right? That when they realised they're trapped or they're about to be trapped, there were some extraordinary, let me say, videos that had been made by these women about catching entrapment of cats and how they then continued to neutralise them, and so on. So we're interested in widening our ambit. We are really talking a lot more to science, people in science, anybody all really who wants to use the medium of video for purposes of scientific communication and education. So I'm not going to go through all of that aspect, but one of the things we did at the very beginning with this journal was to talk about a video component, which we said was 15 minutes long, which is quite a long, for an article, quite a long, but it had to be embedded in the article. It may be, 3 sections of 15 minutes, but, 3 sections of 5 minutes each dispersed through the article. But the main thing was, here was a specification of the technical specification of the video, each video had to have some video content. We've relaxed that a little bit now and really begun to widen it a little bit. But here is the early notice at the Zagreb conference in 2016. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to really, first of all, encourage a very wide, the people involved in this, Jane and Tina, some philosophers from Europe, wanted to really embrace the study of visual culture and visuality and visualization in the widest possible terms. So we're calling that philosophical approaches, if you like, to the study of visuality. And we are looking at, in particular here, not only visualization methodologies, but of course the problem of video ethics when it comes to children, because of the predatory nature of modern society, where young children on video, let me say, predated. We have to be very careful about that, and we have a committee who are really addressing that issue of video ethics. If you want to join that committee, please let Jane know about that. And here are the aims and scope of it. Really, I've said most of this. I think our intention to establish the first video journal of education and pedagogy, and to really begin to develop a business model where the association of visual pedagogies will provide the funding. The author pays funding for institutional members, which is it's not very much compared to many of the other author pays journals in the sciences. It's only $700, I think, US dollars. It's a lot less than many other science-based author pays journals. And what we wanted to do there was to establish a journal where the universities themselves, through their initial foundational membership, would be able to pay the fee for individual members. So that was the concept of the business model that we used, and we're revisiting that. And here we are. We had an early statement about educational research at large, focusing on teacher education. I'm very keen on that concept because remember that the video articles are downloadable anywhere in the world. So it begins to kind of equalize the relationship between publishing industry in parts of the global south. And what we wanted to do was to develop a database, not just of teaching practice that could be used in other parts of the world for comparative purposes, but also databases to do with video activism and other topics that we have yet to specify. So those were the three elements of this journal, and the idea of integrating educational research and practitioner knowledge was really kind of topmost there. A platform for educational research and teacher education, demonstrated pedagogy, and to establish new frontiers and education, publishing, and scientific communication. Now we are not constrained by a major publisher. We can develop our own thoughts and our own practices on that. So here it is. I think, Renee, if we can go, this is the Association of Visual Pedagogies, which is the organisation that holds this conference every year. Here is our publisher, Brill publisher you heard last night at the dinner. This is the website for Brill. I think we can probably go to that and scroll up and down. I mean, rather than really spend too much time addressing it, we can begin to look at this site, and maybe we can go into 2016, the first volume, rolling here. If we go hit that little button on the side there, just to give you a look. How's the time going, by the way? 5. Oh, perfect. I want to leave some time for a bit of discussion. I should have talked and go to issue 1. It's not really issue 1 because this is a rolling cycle. So when articles come in, they are published. There are no issues, except that you can still, within the rolling cycle, you can have special issues involved in this. So you can get some idea here. This is 2016. Have a look at. Let's have a look at the first one. Can we open that up just to give you a look at what it looks like? And you might want to go to the PDF. Oh, here we are. It looks like a normal academic article, except that it has an embedded video. Here we go. So we move down. You can see what it looks like. Simple idea. Why did it take us so long? We had the idea in 2013. It took 3 years to develop to get to that point. And that was a Springer issue. We had some problems with Springer, so that's why we're now with Brill, but it follows the same model. I just wanted to show you that. I wanted to show you, maybe if you can just scroll down a bit further, we can see the video clip, the video side of it. Here you can see that there are these, and you don't need to click on that's a figure, but keep on scrolling down if you like. But let me stop there because I'm sure you'll have some questions, and this is really kind of just a very brief introduction to the politics of seeing in academic publishing, and I'm hoping that you might have some questions that you like to ask. Go. Elaine, please. I'm sorry, I'm actually hard of hearing, so you're going to have to use that microphone if that's okay.
Sorry, thanks. Thanks, Michael, for that overview. I just had a quick thought about, that slide where you had different possible sections for the video journal?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it.
You had a slide on the different possible sections that could go into the video journal.
Sure. Sure.
And you spoke about, you had ideas like, demonstrator videos of proven pedagogy and so forth. I just thought, would you consider like a back channel to the journal? You know how like in ResearchGate and academia.edu websites, they have people putting out drafts or ideas that are being shaped at the moment for the article. Some sort of platform to foster emerging scholars to
good point.
develop their work further.
Very good point.
So not an official channel, but like a backroom channel. I don't know if that's a possibility, but I think that would be really good to foster and support emerging scholars.
I agree entirely.
Thank you.
You made that point at the meeting last night, the business meeting last night, and I think you're absolutely right. Because we've heard that there is a little bit of a gap in technology between younger people who are I don't want to use the term digital native, but they've grown up with the new technologies and are more conversant with them in some cases. But I think one thing, Elaine, is that we will have a dedicated YouTube channel. We'll have also introduced Twitter, but I think that in particular we do need to focus on younger scholars who are really much more involved in as artists and video artists, also as video activists who are not really employed through the university. So there are multiple communities that make up the community here, and I'm hoping you're going to take a lead in the society for some responsibility for encouraging those young emerging scholars, really, and emerging video people. So yeah, for sure. One last question.
You've actually preempted my question, but
sorry.
In true academic style, I'll ask it anyway. Can you just continue to comment on that tension between the word and the image that we have? Because we are quite often talking about images, but we're talking about them in terms of, and you can sort of see from your presentation. Your presentation has been largely words up there. But we've been trying to think about images in a particular way. And it's actually quite difficult to do since we're so enculturated into this world of words.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, one of the ways I've tried to do it is by working with younger academics and artists, because they actually just work within the image and within the video world, and the words aren't are secondary really, whereas the words are primary, where from my point of view. And how are we going to sort of overcome, how are we going to sort of develop through that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and philosophically I don't think there's a standard answer. But let me say this, that when we talk about the print-based scientific journal, when we talk about the book, when we talk about the written word and so on, we have developed amazing range of tools for meta-commentary and criticism that can analyse discourse, analyse the written word and so on. By comparison, for images, and we're really dependent on two major sources. One is the notion of appreciation of art, let me put it that way, the history of art, and a way of looking at a painting or looking at a picture and being able to analyse it in terms of perspective and so as visual elements. And then I think the other, is the film and film theory. But when we talk about relationality of images, we're still, even after 1951, the first video, we're still in the early days. And we need some really good media thinkers around these kinds of issues. And it's really sort of an issue that we should address in the journal as well. So thanks for your question.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Okay, pleasure.